This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Today, our guest is Professor Christian Vom Lehn, who is with Brigham Young University. He's also a Princeton graduate. He focuses on geoeconomics as well as labor economics, and he is a fascinating guy to listen to. We're going to spend our time today talking about the issue of inflation. We're going to put a big focus on in the center of this discussion around inflation and what is happening in the United States today. In the beginning of the discussion, we're going to focus a little more on the philosophy of economics, kind of where he's coming from and how he sees it. And at the end, we're going to talk about the United States and where we are and what opportunities exist. In fact, we're going to do a SWOT analysis of our economy to gain a better understanding of what risks you might be thinking about taking or should be thinking about taking in the current economic environment. Now, again, I'm just an ordinary American who has an optimistic view and a belief that the United States is a cause for good. If you agree with me, push that subscribe button and let's get going with this show. Well, Professor Von Lehn, I'd like to tell you I appreciate you coming on the show today. Thanks for being with us today at the Optimistic American.
Yeah, happy to be here with you.
All right, and I'm going to call you Christian today, if that's okay.
It's great, perfect.
Yeah, and I'm not a student, although I'm hoping to learn from you some things today. So I feel like I'm still being respectful by doing that. Today you teach at Brigham Young University, is that correct? BYU?
That's correct, yes.
Oh, okay. So what I'd like to do is we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about inflation, the economy, the budget, kind of a lot of the current issues. But I find it very interesting, the whole field of economics. And what I'd like to start by doing is having an understanding of where you're coming from. And it's not lost on me that even the study of economics used to be tightly tied to philosophy. In fact, there was really no separate theory of economics. If you go to Plato, he talked about the importance of specialization. And then after him, I believe it was Aristotle that focused on the idea of property rights. But there was such an integration all the way back throughout history that maybe the very first time that it began to become a separate philosophy was either during the mercantilist era or Adam Smith that came afterwards. Today, if you're dealing with microeconomics, it's a lot easier to call it an exact science because you can say, well, here are how many grapefruits are going to be produced on X amount of hectares of land. Here's what we believe the market's going to be. And short of weather, here's what we think the numbers are. That's fairly scientific. But when you move to the macro side of it, there's still a lot of theory and philosophy that matters. What I'd like to have an understanding from you is your journey, the journey that you had getting to where you are philosophically and how you see the world of economics today.
Yeah, I came to economics, as a student many years ago, and I was looking for something ultimately that I thought could be human related, focusing on people and their choices and their needs and ways that could improve human welfare. But I also came at it from someone who had a strong technical background, who was interested in using mathematics and statistics and rigorous analysis to try and tackle these problems. And so I think for me, that's what drew me to economics. And what I try and espouse in the way I study economics is to think about very distinctly two different types of questions and approaches. One is which we call the positive approach, where we're trying to ask, how does the world work? And one of more of the normative approaches, how should the world work? What is the best? What are the things we want in the world around us? And I think much of the economics discipline, including macroeconomists, really aspire to be careful about that. We want to be precise and as scientific as we can be with the tools and the data and information we have. So that way we can then go to the issues of philosophy and different ethics and moral judgments and opinions that people may hold, and then describe, okay, if that's your perspective on the world, here is the best way to carry out those particular priorities and objectives. But as much as possible, trying to ground our analysis in an understanding of how the world really works. And so much of my study and focus as an economist is trying to focus on those positive questions, I have my own normative values and judgments and ways I think about how the world should work. But I first want to make sure that we understand, given any value system or set of priorities, what's the best way, what's the most economical way to pursue those objectives and interests.
So, if you were to look at an issue like the issue of free trade, how would you approach that as an economist? Do you see, and both, well, let's start from a normative standpoint, but how do you see the ideas of free trade, both in terms of how they affect us and maybe how we should be approaching it?
Yeah, I mean, I think my typical approach as an economist, like many economists, is say, okay, let's talk about costs, let's talk about benefits. And then once we lay those all out on the table, let's think about which ones we feel most strongly about and how we weigh and value those. I mean, I think about free trade and I think about, as a value that I have, I certainly am interested in connecting people, bringing people together. And I think exchanging ideas and commodities and having a more interconnected world is often a very good thing and improves our ability to learn from each other. It allows us to take advantage of our different specialization and our skills and our strengths. But I'm also not blind to the fact that increased interconnectedness can come with costs and can come with challenges. Certainly, as we encounter people who think and feel and value things differently than we do, then we have to engage with those differences in opinion. We have to engage with how bringing in the case of trade, imports from another country might affect people in our own country who are producing similar things. And how are those workers and their livelihoods going to be affected as we bring in imports? Those are great benefits to have access to new goods or goods produced at lower costs. But I think it's important for us to assess and say, okay, how can we pursue benefits for everyone? And not just not turn a blind eye to those who might be hurt as we pursue virtuous things as interconnectedness, greater specialization, greater access to resources and ideas.
So, I'll give you kind of my thought, and I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
analysis of it. So, my thinking is free trade has definitely done a tremendous amount to lift human progress around the world. I think there's no doubt if you look at even what happened to China over the last 30 to 40 years, we pulled a billion people or more out of abject poverty. That happened in large respect for a variety of reasons, but one is because the United States opened up their market to them. They were able to sell goods to us, which they weren't really able to do before Richard Nixon. Secondarily, because they began to adopt some more free market type reforms during there was certainly the cultural revolution that happened in China that had caused a lot of problems. Mao had only about a 2.5% growth. We saw after Mao, it jumped up to about 9%. Those free market reforms had an effect. At the exact same time, you're right, that had also a negative effect on some of those people in the United States that were trying to sell goods. So it created a friction. The challenge, I think, today in society is that we're talking about these free market reforms where we're allowing illiberal governments to be able to utilize the rules and the processes of liberal governments, people who believe in free markets and free trade, against them. They're not following the same set of rules. And to me, that seems to be at least a fair argument. I personally completely agree with free trade and free markets, so long as people are willing to live by a fair set of rules and trade, which I don't really see China living by. I'd love your thoughts on that. And it's fine to disagree if you disagree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my perspective on it is nuanced, and I think in the sense, I mean, it comes back to what I said before: is when we open ourselves up to other countries and to other governments and other nations and cultures and peoples, we're going to find differences of opinion, and we find that there are many ways in which China, culturally, institutionally, politically, is quite different from the United States. And there's no doubt that China's rise as an exporter has been a great benefit to the Chinese people in terms of their well-being and welfare. Their economic growth since the days of Deng Xiaoping have been remarkable and impressive, and seen them really rising from being a very poor nation to a rising economic power in the world. And I think there's many people who've been benefited by having access to less expensive goods and services that have come from those exports. But I also think, I mean, the first issue I think that often arises is, China's ability to produce goods and services at much lower cost. Like, what are the origins of that? Are some of those institutional in nature? Are those reflecting different approaches in how what workers' rights are and what working conditions look like in China or in other places in the globe? And so we have to confront these questions of, okay, how do we feel about having access to products that are produced cheaply for reasons that may conflict with some of our values and our preferences and judgments? There's also the question of, do we think by associating and interacting with trade that we can also share ideas at the same time and philosophies and cultures that could potentially improve outcomes if we hold to our values? Do we think maybe by engaging in these trade relationships we can improve those? And many have posited notions of that increased trade, interconnectedness of nations will bring those cultures and institutions more in synchronization with each other. And so that actually, even though there are tensions and frictions along the way, this could be beneficial to greater unity. But we also have plenty of examples in which we see instances where you develop a strong interconnected relationship, and one party, could be China, could be Russia, could be others throughout the globe, have very different values politically, institutionally, at the heads of their government, and take advantage of now what is a dependence and an interconnectedness to basically leverage their power in that relationship to pursue their own interests, which are in conflict with ours as a nation, as a people. And so I think, like any, it's all of the nature of human relationships at a very micro level playing out at a macro massive scale is how do we interact and learn together and grow together while also not allowing relationships becoming a way in which others exert power and harm on others.
All right. So um, I have to take a look at my theory and then try to recognize what the downsides are. What I said to you a moment ago was that I believe that illiberal societies shouldn't have an ability to take advantage of liberal societies not following by the same rules that liberal societies fall by. Okay, so let's play that out. Russia and China. Russia and China are two illiberal societies who operate by a different set of rules. So we're starting to see pushback from the United States on both and pushback from them. Well, it's not lost on me. We get a lot of commodities coming out of Russia. We get oil. We've gotten grains, foods, a variety of different products that have come from them, raw materials. And China, basically, we've been getting cheap labor, the ability to manufacture and to assemble products. So while there may be an upside there, maybe that's to American workers, seems like there might also be a downside to inflation. So assuming that we are going to be putting up walls between us and Russia and China, how do you see the inflationary effects of that? What do you see as being the upsides and the downsides to that type of a policy, which seems to be emerging in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly if we are putting up barriers to trade, making it more expensive to import, placing tariffs on various products coming from other nations, yeah, I mean that's going to raise prices, and I think that's a cost of that type of policy. Now, you know, the details matter, and so we should always try and get our best detailed analyses of, well, how much will prices go up, and I think I don't have a strong analysis that I can draw from at this moment to say how is the quantitative impact of slapping tariffs on certain nations, but we certainly do see that those come back to hurt the American consumer. That increased tariffs do result in higher prices for the American consumer. The question is, when it comes to interests of national security, when it comes to interests of national values and ethics about institutions and governance, are we willing to make that trade-off? Economics is all about trade-offs. So what makes economics interesting is when we have to think about a choice, which is hard because there is a cost and a benefit. And I think, yeah, inflation is going to certainly be a cost of increased tariffs and decreased interconnectedness. But the benefit is potentially increased national security, defense of national values and morals. And how we trade off those two is something we as a nation have to decide.
We have one of the issues that seems to also be going on from an inflationary standpoint is just the change that's happening in demographics. Peter Zion, who's been on our show, has done a great job of talking about the effects of demographics. But clearly, one of the things the boomers, I'm really just too late, a little bit too late to be a boomer, but boomers ought to be very happy that the millennials exist because the millennials are a population group that's actually larger than them. And that are going to be paying for those Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes that keep those benefits going to the boomers and the other generations that come behind them. On the other hand, what's happening with millennials is they've gotten to the stage now where they're becoming buyers, where they're starting to buy big tickets. Where I have a healthcare company and I also am involved in real estate. And we're seeing those millennials coming of age in both, and especially on the real estate side, they're becoming buyers of homes and cars and big ticket items. Um, that means that we have a demand side that is growing. And yet, we just got done talking about we may have a shrinking supply side with China and Russia, both on commodities and labor. So there's probably going to have to be an increase of supply here. But just focusing on demographics, do you agree with Peter that demographics can play a large role in the inflationary problem that we have today?
I mean, I think it certainly can contribute. I mean, I can't say that I've thought about in the current instances about the inflation. Obviously, the last few years has drawn most of people's attention, especially since we hadn't seen inflation like that in some 40 or 50 years. So it really is something we've not thought about for a long time. In the long run, could we see demographic pressures affecting inflation? Absolutely. Is that top of the list of concerns I have right now for inflation and price stability? Probably not. But I also think demographic change is going to hit us in more ways than just inflation, and thinking carefully about demographics and what that means for economic growth. You mentioned supply side production. I think it's going to matter for a lot of our innovation and generation of new ideas. I think all these things are going to be very important to think about, and inflation is part of that package.
All right, so talk to me about inflation. Let's just stick with that subject for a moment and help me understand your view of what's causing the inflation problem today, at least the more immediate problem.
Yeah, I mean, so if you don't mind, let me give just a little bit of context for listeners and kind of how I think about this. I mean, typically in the United States, I think you'd say the goal of policymakers is to see inflation that is stable and generally low. There's some value to inflation, and we can talk about that, but not a lot of it. And we want it to almost be imperceptible, just kind of gradually rising over time. And what's caught our attention is after many, many decades of very stable, quite low inflation, in about 2021, we saw inflation really take off. So it went from being on the order of 2% a year to almost approaching 10% a year before it finally peaked in the middle of 2022 and came down. And now to say it's come down, inflation has come down to about 3%, which is a little higher than what we're used to, but it's closer to what we've seen for a while. But a key difference here is that inflation is telling me how fast prices grow and not what the level of prices is.
What's the difference? I don't understand that.
So think about it, the price, inflation is telling me how fast prices grow. And so so think about driving a car, right? Inflation is telling me how fast I'm going. But if I drive really fast for a while and then I slow down, yes, I've gone back to not driving very fast, but I'm now much further away from my original starting point. And so in that same sense, if I have really high inflation for a while and then inflation slows down, yeah, inflation is, quote, back to normal, which it's getting close to, but prices now are much higher than they were before and are unlikely to go back to levels they were in the past.
Okay.
And so in that sense, I think it can create some dissonance where we can hear in the news inflation is coming down and economists are encouraged by progress, but a typical consumer says, but the prices are still high. And that's right. Those are perfectly compatible statements. And I think so many of us, when we think about the frustrations we feel about inflation, it's less about how fast prices are growing so much as how high prices are. And so in that respect, I think even though inflation has been improving lately, I think there's still a significant of economic discomfort and even outright pain from the fact that prices are now much higher than they were before. And it's going to take quite a bit of time for wages and salaries and purchasing power to fully adjust and help us feel more like we are really back to normal. So all of that is as precursor context for your question. I think economists, perhaps playing true to stereotypes, when we think about core forces that might drive something like inflation, we think about two big ideas, supply and demand. And I think it's really easy to tell stories in which both of those forces contributed significantly to this higher inflation we saw for a few years. The pandemic was characterized by all kinds of disruptions. There were disruptions by virtue of public health orders that led to people being more at home, to limits on activities that consumers could engage in, the limits in what services businesses could provide. That disrupted what we could produce. And then that production disruption then started to snag up supply chains and make it very difficult to get the necessary inputs and pieces of your product. And so it became very hard to produce. And so we faced a lot of shortages. And in the face of shortages, that put a lot of upward pressure on prices. I think that was a key driver of inflation in some of the very early periods of this elevated inflation we saw, 2021, 2022. But at the same time, and being in the midst of a massive pandemic and public health crisis, there were a lot of actions taken by government policy to try and ameliorate the downsides of that, to help protect people from the loss of livelihoods, the inability to work, the consequences of lockdown orders and the like. And so there was a lot of effort to cut taxes and increase government spending and raise the amount of money in circulation in the economy to try and help people weather the economic storm associated with the pandemic. And I think to the extent that we still see elevated inflation now, what we're feeling is mostly the demand side. By virtue of people having more resources in their pockets, more income and assets, that's going to push up their desire to spend. And with only so many goods and services to go around, or at least limited ability to rapidly expand what we can produce, that higher demand is putting upward pressure on prices. And so I think what we're feeling is still kind of some of these residual impacts of elevated demand induced by policy and some of the adjustment to the aftermath of the pandemic.
Who are the winners and losers in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think winners and losers. I mean, if you're thinking about individuals on a fixed income who have a fixed set of assets, inflation is always going to hurt you, right? If you're not continuing to receive income, or you're not having income that's indexed to the current level of inflation or market conditions, inflation suddenly reduces your purchasing power. That hurts. I think inflation tends to moderately benefit those who have debt, in the sense of when they borrowed that money, they agreed on an interest rate that would kind of baked in some expectations about what future inflation would be. And now with surprise elevated inflation, that's going to make the real value of what they have to pay back on that debt lower than they expected. So those are some winners. But I think, all of us are losers in the sense of when there are surprise bursts in prices, that tends to be disruptive in terms of how we conduct our daily business and what we can forecast and plan for the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. This idea, first, people who live on a fixed income, meaning seniors, right? Seniors probably get hurt disproportionately with inflation. Second, the people who save end up being harmed based upon inflation, right? If just as you said, if you're getting a 5% interest rate from the bank, but inflation is 8%, you're basically losing ground every year. You're not keeping up with inflation. On the other hand, if you were a borrower and you borrowed on real estate and you borrowed at 4% to buy a home, or 3% to buy a home, and the inflation rate goes up to 8%, your home is increasing in value much faster than you were as the person who was borrowing the money. Now, renters seem to me to be disproportionately hurt. In fact, very specifically, I've seen in the renting community where rents, I might be off a little bit, but 2 to 3 years ago, a entry-level rent could be $800-900 a month. Today, it's $2,000 to $2,500. Now, that one is interesting to me because, the thought oftentimes is in housing, well, the problem is the commodity prices went up, lumber prices went up, so the cost of the home went up. Here's what really happened. There weren't enough homes. Just that simple, right? There were more people wanting to buy them and live in them than there were people that had them. And so renters, who are at the bottom of that scale, saw that price go up extremely fast, which that says to me that while inflation may not have hurt you if you were a homeowner, it kicked your kids' butts if they were a renter. They really saw a big, and it's not an 8% inflationary rate, a 200 or 300% inflation rate.
Well, and I think in that respect, that's something where, as economists, we sometimes use our own ways and language to describing things. In that sense, we describe this as that's just a housing challenge. I mean, inflation is about the rise in prices across the board. And you're absolutely right. Housing prices have gone up far more than the price of the average things we purchase in the economy, which tells me that this is something about the housing market. And particularly, there is a major issue, as you mentioned demographic change earlier. How do we handle the fact that it's possible we don't have enough supply of housing in the places where people most want to live. How should we adapt to that culturally, socially? What does that mean for the organization of society and density and zoning and regulation? There's a whole set of issues that I think contribute to the housing prices and renting prices for renters being very high right now in many places in the country.
Yeah, and now my ideology will come out on this a little bit, and I always try to keep it in check. Um, and by the way, I was a Democratic mayor. I'm an independent today, but it's not lost on me that the amount of regulations that you have an effect on how quickly you can build homes. There's just no doubt about it. Now, so do supply chains. So you can't blame it all on government. Supply chains have an effect as well. But it is so clear to me that there are divisions that exists inside the private sector, the people who own rental units and the people who are building rental units. The people who are building rental units want to build more. People who own rental units are happy with you having less, right? Because their assets inflate faster. So when you start to think about the dynamics, we love to look at the world in terms of who has capital, who doesn't, who are the wealthy, who's not. It's not that simple, right? There are lots of different factions on all sides. On the worker side of the equation, the labor side of the equation, there are homeowners and there are renters. On the capital side of the equation, there are people building and people who own. But the key factor is that, as you said, if there's a housing problem, you could start by saying, well, let's build more affordable housing. Well, if that's your answer and they quit building affordable housing that isn't subsidized, you're going to have to build a lot of affordable housing to be able to make it work. The better answer is to figure out, how do we get more homes built? How do we get more stock into the marketplace? And again, those challenges, they're not simple, but they're still important, and supply and demand still matters. I find at the elected level official, I've spoken to lots of local officials about this problem, and there's a fundamental disbelief that supply and demand is really what causes the problem. They think it's greed, or it's the one class of people taking advantage over another class of people. It's just a supply and demand problem, and that's where, to me, economists become so important in dealing with these questions.
Well, I totally think. I mean, there is. It's legitimate to observe that as much as kind of core economics teaches us of how markets can be so efficient and deliver goods and services on these kind of fundamental ideas of supply and demand in a very efficient way, sometimes markets don't work so well. Sometimes markets can be inefficient, and that can come from asymmetries in power or information or any host of factors, market failures. And so I think a lot of economics is trying to identify, okay, where are those cases where those emerge? But even in those cases where those emerge and exist, supply and demand yet remain very potent central factors in shaping any outcome we see in any market.
All right, so now help me think about monetary policy. What's the effect of monetary policy from an inflationary standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think the typical playbook for monetary policy when inflation is high is to say, look, we have limited levers that we can pull, limited options at our disposal, but what we can do is we can affect the amount of money in circulation in the economy. And we can basically do that by affecting what interest rates will be in the economy. And the vision being that, well, if interest rates get higher, that's going to reduce some demand, right? If the interest rate on purchasing that house, purchasing that car, investing in any long-term, construction project, if those interest rates are really high, that's going to reduce people's demand, and bringing down demand is going to typically bring down inflationary pressures as a result. That's not the only way you can go about combating inflation, but it's certainly what the Federal Reserve has at its disposal. And the Federal Reserve and other central banks throughout the world are given a very clear mandate that your objective is to keep prices stable, try and manage these prices from not getting out of control. And so what they do is they say, look, we're going to take actions to effectively raise interest rates in the economy. Those are often unpleasant experiences if you're trying to buy something which requires borrowing. That's advantageous to those who are saving and benefiting from higher interest rates on savings products. But it certainly has the net effect of bringing down people's desires to spend and consume, which they hope will overall lower the effect, lower the overall inflation we see in an economy.
Yeah, so one tool of the regulators, of the feds, is the idea of the discount window. It's what's the interest rate that one bank will lend to another bank. Now, if you lower the interest rates, good news is your cost of your federal debt is less. Bad news is federal government's going to want to borrow more. I'm not sure what effect that has on the amount of people that want to lend, but nonetheless, you can see inside of that how the rates that one bank lends to another, and then that bank lends to the rest of us, the effect that that has. But they can also actually have an effect on the amount of capital that's in the system, correct? By quantitative easing was really was designed around buying assets, federal central bank buying assets from local banks, and then giving them back cash to increase the amount of cash that was in supply.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is, I mean, the way in the United States the Federal Reserve System works most prominently to affect interest rates is not to give a dictatorial statement of this is what the interest rate is. Obviously, they had that discretion if they loan directly to banks, but there is a limit to how much they actually loan directly to banks. Mostly what they're deciding is how much do we want to buy and sell of some asset in exchange for something that's liquid, something that's easily spent, basically cash. And so quantitative easing was just another example of what the Federal Reserve does all the time. As they say, look, we want to maintain a certain amount of money in circulation to hit that interest rate. You mentioned this interest rate in which banks loan to each other. And quantitative easing was saying, well, why don't we try buying and selling some different things than we've bought before? Typically, the Federal Reserve says we're going to buy up what banks hold of some government debts, some treasury bills that are not very liquid, aren't very easily spent right away, and give them cash that they can spend and use right away. And now we're saying, well, what if we also bought up some longer term government debt or even some housing assets, all with an approach to kind of, like you talked about, within the context of a market, not by regulation per se, but within the context of a market, take actions that shape market outcomes in a way that pursue national objectives of price stability.
So if the central bank has decided to do quantitative easing, or if they've to buy debts from existing banks, or to go buy debt from the federal government, they're increasing the supply. But they can also do the reverse. They can sell those assets off, which would reduce the amount of money that was in the system. Where's the Feds today in this policy? Are they in a tightening process, or are they or are they lightening up?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly the actions they've taken in the last couple of years have been in an aggressive tightening position of trying really aggressively to sell off these assets and soak up cash, and as a result make interest rates get higher. If there's less cash circulating between banks, that means what banks are going to charge each other on loans to do their business is going to go up. Those interest rates will rise, and those interest rates will get passed on to the consumer. And so that's exactly what we're seeing right now, is very much tightening by the Federal Reserve, and that's what's caused interest rates to get so high. And the ongoing debate right now is, at what point will they loosen? And because inflation has come down, there's some optimism that, hey, maybe we can loosen soon. But the fact that it hasn't come down as much as they'd like has meant that the Federal Reserve has been reluctant to loosen their stance and kind of remains in a fairly tight position in how they're handling the money supply.
So if you were, I mean, I know that the asking you to be the oracle and looking into the crystal ball is always a difficult thing, but where do you think the Feds are going to be going over the next 6 months? Where would you anticipate it?
I expect a lot of status quo. I mean, again, this is forecasting, guessing. I mean, many things
Right.
can change in the next 6 months, but I think the Federal Reserve is very committed to trying to get inflation under control. It's really the top of mind. We need to get this stable again. And they're a little bit dissatisfied with the progress they've made so far. They've made great progress, but they'd like to see more. But they also recognize that the actions they take don't immediately have an impact on the economy. Sometimes it takes time for their actions and tightening and causing interest rates to rise to affect what prices are in the economy. And so I think you'll see them remain in kind of a wait and see holding pattern. They recognize there's a lot of discontent with higher interest rates right now. And so they're probably not eager to raise them further, but they're also not eager to cut them, given that inflation hasn't fully gotten back to where we'd like it to be. So I expect a lot of status quo, wait and see, maybe some progress, but I would be surprised if we see big changes in the stance of monetary policy in the next 6 months.
Larry Summers, who's been on our show, made the comment that the central bank really has two major functions. One is to keep their eye on inflation, and the other is to keep their eye on deflation. And if it's doing neither of those two, that's not necessarily a bad thing from the central bank's position. It's not lost on me that if you look at what the central bank has done, they take a lot of grief. They've made some mistakes. I don't want to take away from their mistakes, but the old idea that this is like a sailboat that you're trying to tilt into the wind to figure out how to adjust that sail just perfectly with a wind that you cannot see to make certain that you don't stall this boat out becomes a tricky thing. But if you look at 2008, I think the Feds did a great job in 2008 of helping us manage our way through it and not having a massive collapse. They did a pretty good job, I think, during the COVID example where they were trying to help us manage it. And at the same time, they're not acting too quickly today to resolve the problem, although I can't imagine that the pressure is not immense. I can't imagine that Biden isn't putting pressure on them and that Trump wouldn't have put pressure on them if he was there to make certain that the economy was improving right around the time they're running for re-election, because that helps them. But the Feds, I think, have helped us in many ways navigate our way through this. And in fact, in my experience in watching the federal government, most of the quality people that we were bringing into our government, the people who were at the top of their class, they weren't being brought into the general government. They were being brought into the central banks. Your thought on the central bank and the job that they've been doing over time?
I mean, I think I wholeheartedly agree with what you said there in your assessment. I mean, I have opportunity in my work to regularly visit different branches of the Federal Reserve. I have many colleagues who are employed at the Federal Reserve in various capacities, and have interacted with various leaders in these institutions. And my impression is, yes, these are human beings, right? All of us are human beings. We have our own opinions and feelings and leanings, but I do think you have a lot of people who really align behind the idea of we want to keep our economy stable. We're not pursuing personal interests, political ambitions, goals. We really say we have a charge given to us as a civic institution to stabilize and help keep the economy going forward at a good pace, managing inflation. And I think you see in that respect that they've been very diligent at that, and both being appropriately responsive and aggressive when conditions require, but also measured and not overreactive, trying to be careful and measure. I agree with you. I think in 2008, the U.S. economy was greatly benefited that the head of the Federal Reserve was Ben Bernanke, who was an expert scholar on financial crises and had a great sense of where mistakes had been made in past times, and was thus able to steer the helm pretty well. And I think Jay Powell has done pretty well, like you say, not without mistakes, but when you're charting uncharted waters and you're trying to figure out where to go and you don't know which way the wind's blowing and trying to adapt in real time, I think they've done an impressive job overall in trying to keep us moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think people sometimes confuse monetary policy with fiscal policy. I think they don't really know the difference. The Feds are in charge of monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy, in my opinion, has been a disaster, and not for the last 3 years, but maybe for the last 10 or 15 years. At the end of 2008, it made sense that our fiscal policy would have been robust and we would have been going out there to spend all that we could to get the economy going. It doesn't make sense when you have a great economy that you're still spending that type of money. And the challenge, I think, to the fiscal policy is, I think it was my past friend who passed away, John McCain. The federal government saying that they've been spending like a group of drunken sailors is a massive insult to drunken sailors, right? The end of the day, they're way out of control. Do you believe that ever becomes a problem, or are we just saved by the idea that we're the world's reserve currency?
Certainly, the U.S. enjoys a position of privilege that benefits us in many ways, including how we conduct and accumulate debt. But I don't think that's an indefinite benefit we're going to enjoy. And I don't think we can assume that we can borrow, however much we want and it'll all work out. I mean, I think the challenge we face right now is that at the moment, while the debt is high, there's not reason to say that this is somehow, definitively a disaster. It's more the trajectory, kind of like you alluded to, is we need to recognize that when times are bad, when we're in moments of crisis, whether it's economic, whether it's in conflicts throughout the world, then those are times when perhaps it is appropriate to have a higher deficit to meet the needs of the day. But having the discipline when things are going better to say, yeah, we're willing to reduce some spending or raise some taxes and kind of rein in those deficits, that's proven very hard to do in the last 20 to 25 years, especially. It's always been a hard thing to do. But I think as a result, given that we take aggressive actions, which are appropriate in the moment to address disasters and crises, if we can't reflect the same discipline to say now we're going to tighten our belts and be more disciplined when we have more resources, that is going to be something which over the long run is going to cause us a great deal of economic pain.
It's funny to me just in thinking about this. I know utilizing the Torah, the Talmud, the Bible, any religious book when you're having these types of discussions seems a bit amateurish. But I do think that you can look at those books sometimes, as opposed to looking at them as religious books, you can look at them as historical lessons. And the lesson that Joseph gave to the Pharaoh by saying, hey, you're going to have 7 years of good and you're going to have 7 years of bad. And here's what you need to do. You need to save during the good years so that you have a bunch of money during the bad years. And what did that do? It made him an incredibly wealthy nation on the planet. There's a great lesson to learn oftentimes by looking backwards in history. And I think what we're doing today is that we're taking these massive benefits that our society is producing from an economy that is just unbelievable, and to give the government and the central banking system credit, they partly helped create that. But this ought to be a time that we're drawing in, holding back that money, utilizing it to be able to deal with that rainy day, and that rainy day will come.
Absolutely. I think, and I think this is just when, you mentioned the difference between monetary and fiscal policy. I think especially in the United States, there's a great effort made to try and make monetary policy as independent of the political process and cycle as possible, to allow them a very strict, clear focus on stabilize the economy. On fiscal policy, that's in the domain of Congress and the domain of politicians who face many competing pressures and interests. And it can be hard to stand up and say we need to be disciplined. And yes, it would be much more pleasant if we had lower taxes and more spending, but we need to be preparing for future times when we want to have deeper pockets to draw from, so we can respond to crisis appropriately.
And so there may be some benefits to inflation, and I want to talk about those if we can. But I remember Bob Woodward wrote this book about Bill Clinton, and what was the name of the central banker then? Greenspan.
Yeah.
Greenspan came in to meet with him, and Bill Clinton told him about all these plans that he had to improve the economy. He was going to spend money on this, and he was going to spend money on that, and he was going to do this, he was going to do that. And anyway, he said, so Mr. Greenspan, you haven't said anything. He says, what's your thought? He goes, well, those are great ideas. You had to go do all those. He goes, of course, if you do that, I'm going to raise interest. And he goes, well, why would you do that? He says, well, you're going to be creating inflationary problems. And so I'm going to try to offset that by making certain that the interest rate is high. So anyway, Woodward said that when Greenspan walked out of his office, he said, that son of a bitch has my reelection in his hip pocket. Now, that story is a good story because it tells you, actually, all institutions corrupt. That power corrupts. That there's no doubt about that. That is as much as I disagree with the progressive left, that is a true statement. But what I also believe is that when you have a balance of power, that keeps those institutions from corrupting too much. I told you we don't talk anything. I try to avoid as much as I can insulting either presidential candidate. But I believe it doesn't matter which one of those two candidates win. The United States is going to survive, right? We keep thinking it's existential. It's not existential. Why? Because we've diffused power. It's in the power of Congress. It's in the power of the Federal Reserve. It's in the power of states. It's in the power of individuals and human beings who can make decisions on a daily basis. Our heroes aren't just our political candidates. It's also Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and a bunch of people who are in the private sector. It's very diffused. But would you agree with that there are some benefits to inflation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think economists certainly think that there are many benefits. I mean, many. There's at least enough that we should have inflation. I think economists are not eager to have a high amount of inflation. Again, I mentioned before that the desired target amount of inflation in the US has for a long time been 2%. 2% is just enough to be something, but something we don't typically think about in most years. Again, I think prior to the pandemic, inflation was not top of mind for anyone for a very long time. Those who lived through the 70s and 80s and experienced the high inflation then still remembered very much what they went through. But that hadn't been the condition for a long time, even though it had been taking place very steadily and quietly. So what are the benefits economists see? I think some of it is that often argued that labor markets are something we want to remain dynamic. We want people to be able to graduate from college or high school and find a job and not feel like it takes an eternity to get that perfect match they're looking for, at least for a starting career. We want people to find jobs. We want people to be able to change jobs. And we want the labor market to function dynamically and very efficiently. And I think inflation can help with that. In the sense of inflation is going to just be gradually reducing costs to businesses over time, especially when they have fixed contracts, whether it's with workers or suppliers. And by virtue of having a gradual, subtle reduction in costs for businesses, that's going to increase their willingness to hire, to expand their operations, and make it more easy for people entering the workforce to be able to find jobs, for people looking to change jobs, to have opportunities. So that's often a big stated benefit of inflation, just to kind of ease costs for businesses who have fixed contracts, to make it easier for them to keep hiring and keep the labor market a dynamic place. But I think perhaps one of the biggest benefits, and you alluded to this in your conversations with Larry Summers, is that by having a little bit of inflation, that keeps us away from deflation. Because deflation can have a number of devastating effects on an economy. We could walk through some of those. But I think as we worry about deflation and how it can cause a spiral of people unable to meet their debts and obligations, how it can cause people to postpone their spending and gum up the economy, there's some value in staying a little bit away from those particular risks.
All right, so I'm going to do a SWOT analysis of the United States with you, but I'm going to do it in a different order. I want to start with this. What do you think our weaknesses are today?
Weaknesses. I mean, I think, so having not systematically mapped it all out and have it laid out in my head of the 5 things I list, a couple of things that come to my mind. I mean, we've alluded to the fiscal position of the United States. Again, the current fiscal position in a vacuum, I wouldn't be so worried about, but I'm worried about the habits and the incentives and the trajectory we've been on in recent years that could cause us concern. So that is an element of weakness. I do worry about the long run. We often get so consumed with the ups and downs and cycles of this recession and this opportunity that we don't think as much about long run steady growth. And we have seen in the United States over the last several decades that general economic growth has been slowing down. And that has many potential factors driving it, some of it demographic in nature. But when it's a lot easier to mediate disagreements about how we should use our resources as a country when the pie keeps getting bigger. But when the pie becomes more and more fixed, then those fights become even more tense and fraught and prone to contentious disagreement and really difficulty to finding agreement and consensus. And so I do worry about that long-run trajectory of slowing economic growth and how it will heighten already rather high tensions between many different ideologies and factions and parties in the United States who have very different approaches to how we should handle our resources.
What's our greatest threat in your mind?
Greatest threat? I mean, I think I will humbly say that I think economics is so often the byproduct of other things, right? Economics can be defined as just, humans going about their daily business and making choices. And I think certainly within an economic sphere, we can talk about the debt, we can talk about growth, but I do think these increasing tensions just between humans, the argumentativeness of society, that we're no longer so collaborative, we're so feeling much more hostile towards each other. Now, we can debate the origins of that hostility, but I think those social tensions and pressures, and whether they're international or micro in scope, I think those are going to present major economic threats that are not so much the domain of economists to litigate and debate how to respond to, but we can certainly appreciate that's going to affect our economy in major ways.
I love Ray Dalio, who made the comment that the two most important things the United States can do, both as individuals and as a country. Number one is to spend less than you make. Right? He said that's number one, and he said the second one is just be nice. Just be nice, right? My view is if you really want to be patriotic, quit insulting other Americans. It doesn't matter what group they are. Just be nice. Okay, now you also look at us and compared to other countries. What would you say our greatest strengths are?
I mean, I do think, I mean, you mentioned before the strong institutional structure of the United States, right? The variety of checks and balances that allows some policymakers like the Federal Reserve to be fairly independent and focused on particular objectives, but also those that limit the power of any particular branch of government. I do think our institutional features are strong. We're not the only country in the world with those, but I do think those develop a great degree of resilience that enable us to be able to weather a wide range of storms. I mean, I do think that there is still a lot of innovative entrepreneurial activity that happens in the United States. There are some concerns about how those have declined some over the time, but I do think that remains by virtue of our institutions and the independence and the ability and the ease with which individuals can start businesses and come up with new ideas and engage in all kinds of economic activities. I think that those opportunities make us a very strong place to be for workers, for people wishing to start a business, for wishing to have a strong economy in general.
All right, now before I get to opportunities, I want to hit on individuals for a moment. What's your recommendation, knowing all that you know about the economy, if you were giving advice to your children who were becoming today working adults? What's the advice that you would give to them or to most Americans?
I mean, kind of maybe in the vein of what you quoted from Ray Dalio, certainly be nice is at the top of the list. Be kind, be collaborative, work together. I think from the kind of more economic viewpoint, I think there's a legitimate answer of go work hard. It's going to take some effort. We call work for a reason. Expect to invest and labor and be patient. I think, I've heard wise religious leaders share that sometimes we let the luxuries of yesterday become the necessities of today. And I think our impatience to enjoy the finer things of life, to rush to the happy ending we aspire to, can sometimes shoot us in the foot and lead us to make ill-suited decisions in the short run. That patience to think about acting with the end in mind, where are things going to end up, and being willing to work hard today to realize, to invest for that future, and not presume that there is some shortcut to bypassing hard work and preparation and patience, to be willing to embrace those virtues. And then, whatever career you choose, find something, work hard at it. If it doesn't fit, try something else. Be willing to be open-minded and flexible and humble about who you are and how you earn your livelihood. But at the end of the day, be willing to work hard and be patient as you pursue these goals and ambitions.
Yeah, that sacrifice part that you're talking about is so important. My partner on this show, Elliot Pollack, he has very similar views, but he likes to say there are really four quadrants that exist in society. If you think about it, the top quarter, the bottom quarter, and the two that are in the middle. And his point is, you can really move still in the United States from the very bottom fairly easily to the second highest quartile. He said there are just a couple of steps that you need to do. The first one is get the best education you can. Even if you're an auto mechanic, go spend the best time you can in educating yourself as best as you can in that field. And there are better jobs constantly in being an auto mechanic that can get you up literally into six figures. The second one is work hard. Working hard is an important component. The third one is spend less than you make. Put some away for savings. And then he says the last one is marry somebody who has a similar philosophy. Marry somebody who has a similar item. If you do those, you're going to get right next to that fourth quartile. But Warren Buffett, I had a chance to meet with him after I left the mayor's office. I was going into the private sector. I don't remember what I was, 30, 35 years old. And it was just for, I don't know, a half an hour or 20 minutes or something like that. But I'll never forget the advice that he said to me. I said, there are a lot of problems going on in the economy. I'm thinking about starting a business, not quite sure whether or not I should. What's your advice? And he didn't spend much time. He goes, yeah. He goes, here's my advice. He goes, first of all, you're in the United States of America. There's no better place in the world to find opportunity than here. And then he said, and you're in Phoenix, Arizona. He says, oh my gosh, you're going to do better than most of the rest of the country. Take a risk. Just go take the risk. You do have to take that risk. You should remember those other items that you just got done talking about also. But this is a good place to risk your bet on. That gets me to the last one. Opportunities, but I want to take it a little different direction. What are you optimistic about with our country?
There's a lot of things. I mean, again, we've touched on, I'll touch it again, maybe beating a dead horse, but we have an awesome institutional structure. All right, the institutions and the way they balance power and create opportunity and give us a lot of freedoms and liberties as individuals to pursue what we do with our lives, how we use our time and our resources, what we can say, how we can participate in our world. I mean, I think that underlying structure of our economy is going to continue to produce opportunity. I think also, although we often feel tensions because of it, I think we also should rejoice in the great diversity we have in the United States. There's so much wonderful things that, someone has ideas that I would never have dreamed of, and that leads to new innovations and products, or new perspectives on how we should organize society and treat other human beings and help one another out. I think we should lean into and embrace the fact that we have so many wonderfully different perspectives, and if we can listen and be nice, like you said, and learn from one another, there's so much we can accomplish as we gather all of these different insights and perspectives, whether it's in technology and business, whether it's in governments and governance and policy, that there is a lot of wonderfully different ideas and perspectives and humans in our country where if we can work together, there's a lot we can accomplish. And so I see that diversity is a great strength of ours and reason for us to be optimistic, provided we can keep practicing our social skills and our willingness to listen and disagree amicably. And I think, we again, we see a lot of technological innovation that often gives us reason for anxiety because it means change. Change is uncomfortable. It always is. But change also, like you say, presents opportunities as we take risks, as we explore new frontiers, as we learn new ideas. And I find optimism in seeing that we're continuing to learn and broaden our span of knowledge and create new products and ideas and ways of doing business that make people's lives better. So I think there's a lot to like as we look to the long run and our ongoing innovation and opportunity.
Yeah, if I could give my children anything, it would be, I'm 63 now. My children are in their, well, actually I have a very young girl, but I also have two boys that are in their 30s and 40s. There's always pessimism. It always exists. And in fact, pessimism can be healthy. It can be healthy because you're questioning kind of what you're doing. But the thing that is clear to me is the reason to be optimistic about the future is the past. I look back at what's happened, and year after year, while the doomers have been there, the people who have the apocalyptic view of what's going to take place in the US and in the world, they keep saying, and my gosh, they sound significant when you're listening to them at the time, and then it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Now, maybe the fact that they're raising those concerns are part of what help us keep it from taking place. So I'm not trying to be critical of them. I'm just saying this is the right place to take a bet on. Everything says to me that the future of where we are, the future of what's going to take place is greater than it's ever been. I am less worried today than I ever been in my life about the opportunities that Americans have. Now, you have to be willing to step up to take advantage of that. You have to get the chip off your shoulder that makes you think that whatever it is that's holding you back is holding you back, because the only thing really holding you back is you. You have to step beyond it. You need to change your mindset and to recognize what's there. Quit letting people terrify you. Quit letting the news media and political parties and other people terrify you, because they win from that. They become successful because then you tune in tomorrow. Better answer is step away from that and start taking a look at the opportunities. And if you look at those opportunities, they're abundant. They're everywhere. You just have to be willing to take a risk to be able to do it. Christian, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. I appreciate the good work that you're doing over there. And again, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.